with all of you. Jordy and Josh, I want to thank you for putting this program together. It's amazing to remember how small the world can be and how we could connect truly from across the world in matters of importance, as the rabbi mentioned. So, Rav Avtzon, thank you for hosting this in your community and for bringing this conversation to your community. And as you said, right, it's Jewish. It's a Jewish idea to not silence conversations. It's to make sure that we are truly engaging in things that are important, right? And when those who cry out, even it says it in the Torah that God says that when those who cry out, right, we should hear their cry. And if they cry out and you don't hear their cry and they cry out to me, I'll make sure that I have their back. God says that in Exodus 22. So it's an interesting just time in general. And so I just want to, again, mark that the fact that we're coming together to engage in this conversation, again, as Rabbi Avtzon mentioned, we need to have these conversations. It's important and it's a frame, it's a start. Who knows where this conversation will go? But at the very last, we should leave with more questions than answers. We should leave with some curiosity and interests, and how maybe we might be able to get involved. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about my background, my family, and where I grew up. So I grew up in Muncie, New York. I don't know if you've heard of Muncie, New York. It's like 35, 40-minute drive north from New York City. So, people have different misconceptions. Some people call Muncie upstate. It's not really upstate New York. Upstate New York has this urban farming-like vibe, where there are some little communities, but Muncie is really, it's one of the largest Orthodox Jewish communities in the world. I joke around that, it's a really diverse place if you're Ashkenazi and Orthodox, because it's true. There are over 35 different sects of Orthodox Judaism, and my family, as a mixed race family, Orthodox family, my mom converted to Judaism 40 years ago. My dad was a Baal Tshuva. He wasn't raised religious. He met a Chabad rabbi, and the rest was history. And I was raised in this mixed race Chabad family in Muncie, New York. It's interesting though, because the school that I went to as a kid until fifth or sixth grade wasn't a Chabad school. It was more of a community day school for ultra Orthodox Jews, if that makes sense. You would have people who were, this might not be meaningful terms for you, but there were Vizhnitz Jews, and there were Satmar Jews, and there were some Litvish Jews. It was a place where the leadership even was coming from different parts of the very Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, whatever the term you might use, community. And so even in that setting, as a kid, I'll just share, I remember vividly being in that setting as a youth, and my family being treated on the one hand with a lot of respect and love. I would say that a lot of the rabbeim, a lot of the rabbis of that school, I can tell you literally dozens of stories in which my mother would take me, to school, or if there would be an issue with one of my siblings having to do with race. I could literally tell you dozens, throughout my life, hundreds. But for today, I'll share a few with you. And just to loop back specifically from my family story, my parents met, 40 years ago. My father wasn't religious yet. My father told my mother, you don't have to convert. He wasn't planning on even necessarily marrying Jewish. And my mother said, "What are you talking about? I have a Jewish neshama." She was already learning. She was already had an awareness. She grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago during the civil rights era. Hyde Park was actually predominantly a Jewish community. If you do the research in Hyde Park, Chicago, my mom was around Jews as a youth. And, I'll say that I think in our family structure, knowing my ancestry, knowing that my mother's side of the family, as an example, fought in the American Revolutionary War. My mother is biracial and I'm multiracial. I'm actually a quarter Black. And then skin complexion, if you looked at my siblings, we all have different color skins. Pigmentation, it's just one gene. So yes, thinking and knowing as a youth that my ancestors fought in the American Revolutionary War, and also knowing that on my mother's father's side, that they were slaves in America, in Sawyersville, Alabama, Charles and Rachel Magruder, and the Magruder plantation down south, knowing while growing up in Muncie, New York, while I had payas, side locks, being a part of the Orthodox community, knowing that ancestry, I had a lot to think about. If you could think, if you could picture, I had a lot to think about around identity. And, I would hear people say things like, just as it relates to like being the child of a mixed in part of a multiracial family, um, I would say that like there were specific moments that were more clear, blatant forms of racism, and then specifically because of the color of my skin and that I passed for white, I had a front row seat in many ways to like what we call microaggressions or what we call. Sometimes people say silly things. Sometimes people are tongue in cheek. We like poking a little bit. We like, whatever word you might use. But sometimes people, late sunnis is like a Hebrew. People like throw a little. They're just messing around when it comes to race sometimes. And because I passed for white, I was able through my upbringing to like really have a front row seat to racism, to forms of racism. Specifically in the school setting, I could tell you one story. I don't know if you remember calculator watches. I don't know if this is a South African thing. It could be, it's not. But in like the 90s, like the Apple watches of today were like the calculator watches. And they were like these little gadget watches with like literally like a tiny little calculator, which like I don't even know how you actually poke the numbers. And it was the coolest thing. It was like every kid wanted it. So anyway, the story goes that I was in second grade and it was the middle of Berkat Hamazon, the benching, the grace after meals. Imagine just like a lunchroom with like 450 kids under the age of 10. Like it was just a big school. And a little boy leans and Baruch like during that, a little boy leans in and he whispers in my ear and he says, "You're not Jewish." And I'm like, "Huh?" And he's like, "You're not Jewish. You can't be Jewish. Your mom's black. You can't be Jewish." And I'm like, and I look at him and in my head, I'm like, oh my God, he's right. How could I be Jewish? My mom is black. And I remember starting to cry. I just started crying. And friends, we know there's so much pain in this world right now in general, let alone the color of your skin, but specifically when it's targeted because of the color of your skin, right? Or because of your background and your ancestry. And so I started crying. And the rabbi he didn't even flinch because he knew my family, he knew my name. I have two older siblings. I'm the youngest and I'm the lightest skin. So he knows my whole family like story. And he probably taught my siblings. He like grabs my hand and he takes me to the principal's office and he doesn't even ask me what happened. You know, thank God we have good rabbanim like Rav Avtzon, people who are pastoral, people who are caring, people who are like trying to offer. But like this guy was not interested in how I was feeling. He brought me to the principal's office. The principal sits me down at the table, and he doesn't ask me what's up. He doesn't. I'm still whimpering away, but I watch him. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy like literally is not even asking me what's going. I'm like, you know how we are when we're sad and we want care. We like let people know we want care. You know, he knew what was up. He knew it had to do with race, and so he basically, I think he was on the phone or he was finishing something, and then he basically comes over to me and he brings me to his desk and he takes out of his drawer a calculator watch, which was like again the thing, in a beautiful like packed like cellophane calculator watch, and he hands it to me and he says, let's just keep this between you and me. Like, don't tell this to your mother, because my mother had already showed up to his office 1,000 times, So like, just keep it between. And I took the calculator watch like very excitingly. I get home, you know, my mother, how's her day, whatever it was, and she says to me, she's like, "Oh, where did you get that?" I was like, "Oh, Rabbi so-and-so gave it to me earlier today. And he told me not to tell you that a kid said that we're not Jewish because you're black." And then my mom literally freaks out again and takes me down, back to school the next day with the calculator watch in her hand, returns it to the rabbi. And she gave what we call tochacha, I guess, rebuke. She would try to reason with the rabbis. And my mom, not everybody has the energy. Like, we all need to know where we're supposed to sit and what we're supposed to do and all of that, like what our role is, right? Racial equity, I think we all agree. Like, people should feel free and feel like they, James Baldwin, who was a big civil rights leader in America he was a black man, he would say, when he speaks to white audiences, he would say, he's no longer alive. He would say, he's like, listen, what black people want, they want what you want. They want to be left alone. They just want to live. They just want to live, right? And this idea So my mother had given people that feedback in multiple different ways. And so one other example was she was one time in a shiur in a class. My family was Lubavitch, and my mother would very often go to classes and Torah study, and she still does. She's very involved in Muncie's local Jewish community. She was in a specific class. I had met previously the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who I hope you've heard of several times as a youth. My father's side of the family was also involved in securing 770, even as the location, Jacob Rothstein, for 770, and helped bring over the previous Rebbe, not the last Rebbe, but the previous one, the Friedeker Rebbe. And my mother was learning with in a shiur with a Lubavitcher, and that Lubavitcher was throwing around the word for in Yiddish for a black person, which is Schwarze. And Schwarze is it's a derogatory term. Bottom line, it's a derogatory term. It's a racist term. It's used to explain, even if it literally just means Schwartz, just means brown or black, right? It's more than that. So my mother told that rabbi, saying, "Listen, Rabbi, you're teaching Torah. It's beautiful. It's a very special thing." And maybe I'm saying it in my own style of way of saying it, but she said, "But how are you using this word Schwarza? It makes no sense." And he said, "Listen, I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about he's like, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about other black people. You're not what you're talking about, and even Chris Rock. I don't know if you've heard of him. He has a bit on this that I don't like. I don't appreciate it. He says there's a difference between black people and the N word, and I'm just like, no, dude, no, there isn't. Like that cultural voice, it's complex. But anyway, my mother said to this rabbi, the rabbi said, I'm not talking to you. My mother said, I don't get it. Like, you're a rabbi. And the rabbi said, well, what would you do if the Rebbe, right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe used this word Schwarza. My mother said the Lubavitcher Rebbe would never use the word Schwarza. And to that rabbi never used that word before, never used that word again. And I think it's just a lesson of just each of us sit in different places and have the ability to influence conversations in a different way. And even while I tell you a little bit about me, I'm just one person. I inherited my story. You inherited your story. Each of us feel like there's different pieces to who we are. And how do we use our stories? We know we have a holiday dedicated Passover, just to thinking about how we have what the rabbi say, tzachot leshono, right? That people should have clarity of speech when they're at the Passover Seder saying, oh, this is my story, right? So I think each of us have a place and a position.
Thanks, Isaiah. That gives us so much insight,
Yes.
a little glimpse of insight into kind of some facets of what it was like growing up in Muncie and having a mom who was black and a dad who was white and some of those dynamics. Maybe Rav Avtzon, if you would be willing to jump in here. I think clearly America is a large place, and certainly even within New York, there's a lot of different communities. Rav, maybe for you growing up in Crown Heights, what how much exposure or interactions did you have with people of color, and what were those experiences like?
So actually, I could have a conversation with Isaiah because Isaiah, I believe we both lived through the Crown Heights riots. Is that correct?
Yes, it's true.
Okay, so to give people some context, in 1991, in August, the race tensions between the Hasidic Jews and blacks in Crown Heights was very intense. Pretty much in Crown Heights, at that time, today it's gentrified, but at that time, you were either Chabad or you were black. That was as diverse as it went. And it wasn't a comfortable relationship. And then a black boy was unfortunately killed by a Hasidic Jew who was driving through a red light. And forgive my French, but all hell broke loose. And for 3 days, the place went wild. So Isaiah, I'm going to ask you, what do you remember of that time?
I mean, I'll tell you that I remember my mother coming home one night saying that she was interviewed by ABC News because she was a black Chabad woman. My family, I identify as modern Orthodox today. Like my teenage rebellion was becoming modern Orthodox, in many ways from my upbringing. But I remember vividly, and that was much later in my life. But at that age in my life, I remember vividly just my mother, and my parents as a whole, people, even right now, it's really special. People are reaching out. It's really special that people are connecting. But I would say that I remember them being torn and stuck feeling stuck in the middle of a lot of things. And my mother still references that time when when they were there, and like I just thinking about how much of like their experience I don't think they were living in Crown Heights. We were not living in Crown Heights during the Crown Heights riots. Like at that point we were already in Muncie, but basically right before I was born, they were, right before my brother was born, they were living in Crown Heights. It was already mid 80s. But I would say again, like just feeling stuck. I think a part of my identity personally, there are other race related issues that have happened in Crown Heights since the Crown Heights riots. And I lived in Crown Heights for 2 years, and I was always on call with people from Chabad.org, and like, people who are like really trying to have strong race relations in Crown Heights. Chabad takes it very seriously to hold those relationships intact, and there have been, so I think in general, Jews of color, Black Jews, we sometimes, and I think maybe this is true for all of us to an extent, but we feel stuck in the middle of stories. We feel like we're hanging in between things, and I think that's like a product of our of gullus, right, of exile. Like we inherit all these things from so many different places, and we try to make sense. Like even right now, all of the noise, it's like it's hard to make sense. So I would say, like, if I were talking for my family around the Crown Heights riots, I would say, which I can't, I could only speak for myself, and I was 5 or something. Is feeling stuck, feeling like there's so many things that need to happen, and there's so many things that we want to make happen, and like we want to make sure we have our voice, but it's so hard to find your voice. It's like all of that, I would say.
Well, yeah, for me personally, it was a very scary time. A Jewish man was killed. It was 3 days of rioting. David Dinkins, at the time, the mayor. I saw today the new statement is David Dinkins moved to the second worst mayor of New York after de Blasio, because everyone's loving him right now. But at that time, Dinkins wasn't popular. And yeah, it exasperated a relationship. And I remember growing up, and that's something I want to bring up, and obviously I'm not the talker tonight, not the speaker. I remember feeling very uncomfortable to greet a Black person. It was like there was an aggression. Did you feel that? Like, was it just my perception, or was that?
Yeah. Well, it's actually, I mean, you mentioned this, Rabbi, while you were framing a little bit about Crown Heights. Right now, Crown Heights is the second fastest gentrifying area of New York City. So I live in Harlem, which is the first fastest gentrifying area of New York City, and Crown Heights is the second. And so much so that there are many Lubavitchers, even people, Chabadniks, who can't afford the rent anymore. If they don't own, they're moving to like East Flatbush. There's new, and so because of that, there's actually the question of racial tensions. Who was there first? In many ways, these communities emerged simultaneously, and in many ways, the Lubavitch community planted their roots down simultaneously, while other immigrant communities were also there. So it's the Chabadniks didn't gentrify on Crown Heights. It's not because the Chabadniks were there since the 50s. There was a voice already, really a strong voice of Lubavitch, while already other Black immigrant populations, Caribbean populations were moving to Crown Heights in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So it's complex because of the context, because Brooklyn is this gentrified. To me, I don't know, my experience of race walking down the street, even as someone, by the way, who, when I see a Black person walking down the street, by the way, I get excited. Like when I see a mixed race family, when I see a multiracial Jewish family, forget it. I'm done. Like, I'm just like, especially like, I feel weird because I'm like, how do I let them know that I'm mixed race? Like, do I just go like, hey, love you, I'm also mixed race, my mom's Black, just letting you know. Like, I don't, but so when I pass people down the street, I'm always like, yeah, I put my universal move when I pass people down the street is I just put my hand on my chest and I just like kind of, I do a little lead. So, but I'll say that even living in Harlem, which is similar, there's some people that I try to make eye contact. It's funny because as we were talking when we first connected last week, you were mentioning that in South Africa, there's almost like, it's like institutionalized to like be courteous when you walk down the street, you make contact. But I agree that in New York, somewhere like Crown Heights, even in Harlem, there's some people who see me and I'm wearing my yarmulke and I have my tzitzis and, and they see me sometimes in a suit jacket. I'm doing, a different vibe. And like, I feel connected to them, but some of them see me as what? They see me as the people who stole their grandparents' apartment, basically. They see me as people who are moving in and taking over. I don't think that's true for Lubavitchers and Crown Heights. What I think is true for Lubavitchers and Crown Heights is that there's clear, this Kingston Avenue, and when you look at the streets, like it's, we don't.
So let me actually explain let me give some context to what you're saying.
Yes.
Oh,
Joy, give me 30 seconds, just let me explain. Basically, so first of all, blacks in America is very different because the word African American gets thrown around a lot, but pretty much I didn't grow up around African Americans. I grew up around Caribbeans. And the word black is very much thrown around, but like it's not. I didn't really know any African Americans. The whole Brooklyn is pretty much from Jamaica and other places. And yes, in the 1950s, the Crown Heights area was 100% Jewish, and then everybody started immigrating to the suburbs, and Chabad was the only one that stayed. And at that time, lower housing came in, and there was this tension. But yes, just wanted to give context. So Kingston Avenue is the middle street of Crown Heights, which is Jewish, but as you start moving away from there, it just becomes much more diverse.
Yeah, I think that's a really perfect maybe segue. And Isaiah, what you were saying in terms of your experience walking down the street in Harlem today is a really maybe just good launching pad to very briefly just kind of describe what's been going on in and around New York and over the entire US over the last couple of weeks in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And unfortunately, this isn't the first police brutality murder. There's been a series over the last several years. Mm-hmm. And so maybe just briefly explain what's been going on and, why this incident, this murder in specific, has caused such an uprising.
Yes. It's a great question. Just specifically to George Floyd, he was a catalyst for something that was already in movement, right? A catalyst by default, something that has already happened, a catalyst just pushes that. It creates a tipping point. So George Floyd, in context, and I think so much of, as we approach any, without making an assumption about anybody who's listening around like, what is your relationship to a discussion around race and racism? You maybe have never spoken about it comfortably. You maybe have spoken about it in school. You maybe have a degree in it, for all I know, right? But the reality is that contextualizing this moment is something that most people are having trouble doing. We're so quick. We Instagram. We go on social media. We forget context. So context, just like on where America is holding. To understand, and I don't know if you've heard this term, systemic racism. What does systemic racism mean? It essentially means that embedded in the institution of America, American democracy of the West, since its foundation, Black people were not seen as equal. They were actually seen as subhuman. That's fact by law. There's no two ways to slice that, and that's like a hard stop. End of the sentence, right? So much so even right, Native Americans, we know that the history is clear that first when Europeans came to America, there were Native Americans in every single place that Americans live today. There were Native Americans, and there's proof of that. And so there's these stories that who controls the narrative? Who decides what stories we actually focus on and what we don't? Who decides when they publish an article with a title, and instead of calling it like a murder or an act of racial injustice, right? You flip it on its head and you call it something else. You call it, a criminal was how the media works. But I just think in terms of like responding specifically to your question, Jordy, like if we follow the fact that in 1850s, 21 million people in America, humans, Black humans, were seen as subhuman. 21 million of them legally were slaves, right? And we know that tomorrow is known as Juneteenth, right? And it's even it's the Black Independence Day. Why? Because when Abraham Lincoln created the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, September or whatever it was, and he announced the emancipation, it took a year and a half, 2 years before all the states got on board. Bottom line is that many of them didn't get on board, and many of them started, shipping their property, i.e. slaves, to places like Texas. Texas was the last place, right, on June 19th, tomorrow, 1865. Texas was the last place to have slaves, and one of the people from the Union came, a governor maybe or a general, I think it was a general, and he came and he said, "Guess what? Hey Texan, slave owners, guess what? Your property is no longer your property. Hey, slaves, guess what? You're no longer slaves. If you want, you could work together. If you want to hire them, go ahead and right." So I'm sharing all of this because if you think about the thread of American history, the systems of law, like all we need to do to understand what's happening in this moment is you just follow policy, law from really the 1800s until now and seeing what laws have actually disadvantaged people of color. Seeing, for an example, when it says all men are created equal, right? And this idea, we hold all truths to be self-evident. Was that including women? Nah. Yeah, okay, women's suffrage, 1920s, fine, women could vote. Was that including Black women? No, it wasn't. Okay, fine, the 65, 60s, women could vote. Were all states on board? No, some states, Black people weren't even able to vote until the 70s and 80s. There were all these, right? And so we forget about law, mass incarceration, when it comes to police and police reform. Again, all these things have to do with policy. And we know in Judaism, and I'll land with this, we finished, in many ways, different holiday cycles. And we know that the calendar is supposed to be reminding us constantly of what? The fact that we left Egypt. Zecher liyetzias Mitzrayim. We're supposed to be reminded of that. But what is the whole Torah of Egypt? Is that freedom, what do we do right after we leave Egypt? We go to Har Sinai. Freedom without law, right, is not freedom. It's, what do you mean? To just say everyone's just hefker and free? No, the whole idea of, right, and what emancipation did, what the end of slavery did, is it set up Jim Crow laws that lasted for 100 years until 1965, right? And then from 1960, we see laws constantly being put in place to disadvantage people of color. So what's happening right now? What's George Floyd's death? What's this tipping point? What do you mean? We're continuing hundreds of years. There's context here, friends. It's not random. And I think that, and racism isn't a myth, and systemic racism isn't a myth. It's something that we could track through our history of the West.
So Isaiah, what are you doing currently, and kind of in response to all of this?
Thank you for that. Well, first and foremost, I'm just trying to take care of myself, have a good work-life balance, exercise, eat well, daven, like pray to God, for real, because there's no way to really, any of us, to go out and do the work if we're not balancing. And I feel like for me, my middle name is Joseph, and there's a line from Joseph, L'michya shalachni Elokim lifnechem, right? Joseph says to his brothers, hey, listen, I was sent here for you. God sent me here for you. God sent me here to be here for you. And I feel that Yosef line calling out to me, as my middle name is Yosef, because I feel like my ancestors sent me here and I feel called. And so today, even just alone, right, having calls with a rabbi from a synagogue, speaking to, Yeshiva University about what they're scheming and what they are doing from the place where I went to rabbinical school. I had a support group with Jews of color today, different Black Jews. Right before this, I was on a different panel right before with ROI, which is like an international Jewish leadership platform. And I would say, like, what I'm specifically doing is trying to contextualize my voice and use my story, my family story, my ancestry, my background, where I'm sitting. Each of us, some people say, oh, my story's not cool. Like, your story's really cool. I don't really have a cool story. And I'm always like, how dare you say that to yourself and to me? What do you mean? Like, each of us from where we're seated have an incredible wellspring of our own life and how we could show up to this moment. So I'm just trying to do that in my own way. It also happens to be that Jordy introduced me as rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor of Jewish Federations of North America. It's a new job I'm just starting. And my job is specifically around race relations in the Jewish community for America, for all different denominations of Jewish life. And it's also being like a consultant to like anyone who reaches out to me. And it's a new post. It's very exciting. But at the end of the day, I really feel empowered. Like, I feel like I'm here to be here for the Jewish people, for America. My ancestors make sure that that I'm showing up for America also, as they literally founded, like one of my ancestors was a founder of America. So like I feel compelled by my background, and I'm trying to actually act what I'm trying to do, like, in the shorter one line is like I'm trying to activate people from where they're at to engage deeply in issues around racial equity in the Jewish community, and how the Jewish tradition compels us to respond to this moment.
That's really, really amazing and important work. Can you maybe tell us a little bit? I know that Black Lives Matter, this kind of movement that has really just sprung up enormously in the last few weeks, has a lot of connotations, and not all of them positive, specifically surrounding things like anti-Semitism and anti-Israel
Yeah.
things. So can you maybe talk about, just briefly touch on
Yeah.
that, and kind of as a Jewish community, how you think we should respond to that, or how different Jewish communities in America are grappling with that?
Yeah. Yeah, but bombshell question, bombshell issue, something I talk about all day. I talk about with Hasidic Jews, I talk about with Yeshivish Jews, I talk about with modern Orthodox Jews, liberal Jews, Reform Jews, non-religious Jews, secular. Well, I even have a close relationship with a guy named Hawk Newsome, who is one of the leaders of New York Charter for Black Lives Matter. If you go online and you type in his name, Hawk Newsome, he's a guy who's like totally doing a lot of things. And I see him as like a friend of mine. We've gotten lunch together in downtown Manhattan in kosher restaurants, where he's this 6'5" black guy, and we're just talking about, like, literally he's a very spiritual religious man, and we're just talking about God, and we're talking about religion. He went to Touro Law School. He's like quite the character. Anyway, with that said, like, chevra wise, I think we have to remember that all these people are people, right? And all these people are essentially, what are they really asking for? They're asking for equality. I mean, how they approach that, the goals, I think the goal is maybe equality. How they get there, oh my gosh, what a mess, right? So what's Black Lives Matter? Let's take a step back. Again, saying everything before about any understanding how to react and respond to this moment takes catching up. How much history do you know? Do you know the history of the West? Do you know the history of African slave trade? Do you know, right? So also Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter first was coined in 2014, just FYI. I think it was Trayvon Martin who was murdered by a police officer in 2014. And the police officer was not sentenced, was acquitted. And from there, the line Black Lives Matter started trending, and then it grew. And then eventually there was a movement for Black Lives, and they created a charter. And in that charter, there's a section about what we invest in and what we divest from, right? And what we're a part of and what we're not. And then it goes and it has a section about apartheid places, and it lists Israel, right? And so what happened there, you see in the actual structure of the movement for Black Lives, something that essentially squares Israel, like the organization Black Lives Matter, as an anti-Israel institution. Since that moment, though, guess what? Since 2014, what has happened to Black Lives Matter? It's become a national movement, like Jordy was mentioning. It's become something that is like absolutely almost the three words that symbolize racial justice in America, racial equity in America. And it's become not only that, like we are seeing more and more and more and more Americans are actually using these words, Black Lives Matter. And not only forget, like, if where you hold with Israel, right, or pro-Palestine, or if you see Black Lives Matter as like we'll get into some of the political issues with Black Lives Matter, I think, in a second. But like wherever you sit with things of like, you do support Black Lives Matter, you don't support Black Lives Matter, the movement today, in fact, does symbolize in many ways this voice for racial equality in America. But with that said, there are plenty of organizations like what Dr. Martin Luther King was funded by, was the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund. And that fund is thriving right now. People are doing incredible work through that. There are plenty of other fronts and ways in which people are engaging racial equity. What I want to just mention, though, for Black Lives Matter is where the movement is today is it's localized. It's localized by chapter. So on the national level, it's called Black Lives Matter. And then locally, each local chapter and charter decides what policies they go for, all of it. It's local. And so there are several platforms of Black Lives Matter that are just staunchly anti-Israel. They're pro-BDS and they're anti-Israel. And so what has happened in Jewish communal life is not, before we even talked about Black Lives Matter, though, is we live in America right now is very volatile in a political sphere as it relates to identity politics. Everything is wrapped up in intersectionality. If you don't know what these terms are, you should Google them, because it's just like, what's up, you know? But like intersectionality, what it means, having all these multiple identities. There's in politics today, there's like a privilege police, like, right? Like, how oppressed have you been? And if you're not that oppressed, you can't speak. And like people, you know, there's different revolutions, and some of them, listen, if there's a single, you know, I mean, I'm American, so I can say this, you might disagree. There's a single country who could address these issues and turn them on their head and truly create equity for women and truly create equity for people of color. I think America could do it. Are we doing it? Are we close? No, we're not even close to home. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. I'll pause.
How do you think we can get there? I mean, certainly that's a big question, but maybe in some small ways, or big ways.
Yeah.
But, you know, if we really understand, as you're saying, this concept that there's systemic racial injustice, what can we do to at least begin to eradicate that?
Yes, thank you. I mean, yes, going through, you know, even thinking about Black Lives Matter, what I find to be hard and frustrating, and what I'm doing personally with everyone I talk to, is that if Black Lives Matter is the end of the discussion, then there's a greater issue that the individual, I think, has. Like, and with all my love and respect, but I think anyone who looks at Black Lives Matter and says, "Oh, I'm out," they clearly aren't understanding that this is an issue for humanity. This is a human rights issue, and this is about all of us. This is that we're created in the image of God, and we all have an obligation. And so anyone who just says, "Oh, I can't," Black Lives Matter, anti-Israel, pro-BDS, I can't. Right. So to me, the first thing is making sure we remind ourselves that even if there's issues with how we engage in this, but that we recognize that we have a spiritual, moral, religious obligation to be involved. I think that's Aleph. I think that's the first thing. It's recognizing that this is wrong, right? Recognizing that this is wrong. And if we say, I'm not going to do it through Black Lives Matter, okay, fine. Maybe you should say Jews for racial justice or something. Maybe it's like racial equity now, like the Torah says racial equity, or the Torah says social equity for all, right? Think of like Shabbos and Shemitah and Yovel. Everybody should have rest, right? And I think that, you know, the more we like kind of just recognize that we have to make a choice to join the conversation. That's like Aleph. Just start enjoying the conversation. Second, from there, I think that how we move the needle forward, it is tailor-based. It takes a long time to build a movement, but it is tailor-made to individuals. I think there are things that all of us could be doing and should be doing, but then specifically, and so I'll share a few things, but then specifically when it really comes to the work, there's 1,000 things you could be doing, and you need to figure out what feels good for you. And as I speak to shuls and rabbis and spiritual leaders and their boards and their social action committees and they're this and they're that, and you know, it's like, one, are you really in this conversation? Do you really care? Like, and I think like even this is a testimony of your community. We're you know, if this is the first time we're doing something like this, fine, but like we're starting a conversation. But then two, it's like, what is appropriate for where you're seated is like absolutely a foundational question. It's knowing who that person is when you're addressing them. But then simply put, there's so many things that we could do. One, time and money are two easy, quick things. Are they the only thing? No, right? But those are things, right? So specifically, if we're not supporting the movement in some way with literally our physical hands and feet, or through simply showing up, putting our name, like, you know, donating $18 or whatever your currency is. What's your currency again? I've never been. Oh, you're muted.
Rand.
Okay, amazing. Yes, that. You know, and like, but it's showing up, and it's, again, my name, Isaiah Rothstein. When I donated my 18 or whatever to NAACP, oh yes, my name shows up, and it shows up as a Jewish name, and that's something that's important to me, and it's about showing up even in these tiny little ways. So donating your time or money is one thing. History, reading, learning, contextualizing is another thing. And that sometimes is learning about who you are. How far could you go back? Could you tell me your great-great-grandparents' name and where they came from and where they lived? Some people can, but most people can't. Most people feel, you know, again, the Jewish people in exile, we have been all over the world, right? The last it's only the last 150 years, 200 years where we're like settled into like four major areas. Like it used to be that we were truly just kind of swimming from country to country in the Mediterranean, going, some of us making our way. So, so just this idea of contextualizing our journey, that would be a second important piece. And then the third thing I would just say, and again, Taylor making it for institutions, but for individuals, is how are you lifting up voices of color in your life? Now, what I mean by that is, yes, there are celebrity voices of color, and that's cool. But like, are there things that you're reading? Have you read like historians that there are Black people who have been involved in every single major, vocation, every single major area of study, right? There are Black historians, Black poets, Black musicians, right? There's so much there. And how is it that, in what ways are we reminding ourselves of that voice that Black culture has added to society? What ways are we reminding ourselves that we have benefited and we've appreciated like so much of the Black voice in society? And how are we bringing that to life? How are we, and a question that I always ask is like, how are you using your platform to lift up people of color's platform, especially in this moment when many of them are calling out? And so I think that's, and then there's more, but that's a few.
Those are some really great suggestions. Thank you so much, Rabbi Isaiah. Maybe if we can turn to, well, first of all, if people want to send in questions, we've already have a number of questions from the community that we're going to ask Rabbi Isaiah in a couple of minutes. And if anybody else wants to send in, please just message in your questions now. And in the meantime, Rav Avzon, if we can perhaps ask you, I think, clearly South Africa has its own very long history with racial injustice and racial inequality. And I think, in the last 30 years, South Africa has obviously come a very long way since apartheid, but probably still has a very long way to go. And maybe, Rav Avzon, in your kind of unique perspective, growing up in America and being a community rabbi here in South Africa, if you could, maybe just talk about how you think what's going on in the States right now applies to us in our community and affects us in our community today. I think that would be great.
That's great.
Okay, so I'm going to say something, and Isaiah, I hope you agree with me. I'll say this.
I love you either way. I just want you to know.
It's okay.
Letting you know.
I know. That's why I'm comfortable to say it. I always found that judging a person over something they cannot change is fundamentally intellectually dishonest. Forget about morally dishonest. In other words, if I don't like you because you were born Jewish, what am I saying about you? You can't change it. So if I don't like an idea you stand for, it's one thing, because then I could sit there saying, you could either agree with me or disagree with me, and maybe you'll change your idea, maybe I'll change my idea. But I believe very much in debating ideas. I fundamentally have an issue when you say that, oh, that person born with that color of skin is of a lower class. That doesn't make any sense. And I've moved to this country, and I'll be very honest. A lot of times people will say, Rabbi, you've only been here a few years. Give it a few more years, you'll become a racist. There are too many things. And
some shit up. Yeah.
And listen, I get where they're coming from. Maybe they've had a lot of experiences, but what they're struggling to understand is the fact that the person that you had an interaction with, let's say, for argument's sake, give you the benefit of the doubt, you had negative experiences, has nothing to do with the color of the skin. It might be a cultural issue that they have. It might be a cultural issue that you have. But how can the color of skin affect anything? Like since when does color of skin affect your IQ? The color of skin affect your morality? A color of skin affect anything? So for me, that's always been mind-blowing. And I've shared a story, if you mind, give me 30 seconds, of sitting on a bus in Italy at the age of 20, going to the airport, and a young Muslim kid sits down next to me, and right away his mother jolts him away.
Wow.
Okay, and I remember thinking, and those words came to me, you hate me and you don't know my name. Since then, I've stopped being a racist. If I ever had an ounce of it in me, obviously I can't talk about my subconscious, but consciously. At that moment, I realized she knows nothing about me, but she won't let her kid be there. And the same thing, I walk down the street, I see a black man or a black woman, I know nothing about them other than the color of skin, and I'm making assumptions about something they can't even change. Like for me, that would be the first thing I would say to the community. Like, how can we look at a person created in God's image? First of all, who said God's white? You know, everyone has an image that God's with a white guy with a long white beard. Maybe he's a black woman. I mean, maybe she. Like, I don't know. And like, maybe it doesn't have a color. But like this assumption of what we are. And one final point: as Jews, we're actually dark. The fact that Ashkenazi Jews are pale right now is an exception. But Jews are Arabs, and we're naturally. If you go back to Moses, he was a dark fellow. He wasn't white. As was most of the Jewish people throughout history, and like the Sephardi Jews till today. So being racist and saying color of skin affects you, you're pretty much putting the mirror on yourself.
Yeah, one thing I just want to share back, that's beautiful. One thing I want to share back also is that like I recall there's a story about a certain person who was liberated from the Holocaust, and I forget his name now. I should probably find out who quoted this first, but he says that while the American tanks were coming in to his death camp where he saw these American tanks with an American flag, and he sees soldiers get out of the tank. And when he looks up at the tank, he sees the first soldier that gets out is a black person, and he records that when he sees this person coming out of the tank that just bulldozed through the wall of the death camp, he looks up and he said, "I never saw a black person in my life before, but I was sure that he was an angel." Right? And like this idea that like what stories are we inheriting? Like who that little boy in my school when I was in second grade, who told him that was true? Like who told him that because of the color of my mother's skin or my background that we weren't Jewish? Like who told, and whoever told him, I guarantee you they were close to him. I don't want to blame his parents. I don't want to point fingers, but there were people in his life, and who told them? And who told them? So what stories are we inheriting? And I think, and at the end of the day, what are we going to be judged by? Like, we're not going to be judged by what we inherited. We're going to be judged by what we did with what we inherited. We're going to be judged by our actions. What do we do? What do we do? We know that, so I mean, but what you're pointing to, Rabbi, about like just like how is it possible that like in social interactions there's already this element of race? Like why should my interactions be so racially charged? That's so weird. Like you didn't quite say it like that, but that's what I'm hearing from you. It's like, it's, if we just think basic about humanity, like why would it be weird for me to pass another human on the street? And the answer is a lot of things, right? There's tribalism, we know in general. What do you mean? You chill with your chevra, you chill with people you're comfortable with. You chill. Some people are border crossers or bridge builders or whatever, but like, there's each of us, we have, think of middle school lunchroom, we think about where we want to sit, where we don't want to sit, but at the end of the day, what the rabbi is also saying, like, how could it be that, okay, maybe you're not the person I want to have lunch with, but like, am I going to take your lunch and take it away from you? Am I going to say, no, you don't get lunch? Am I going to, right? Like, no, like, and so I think that's kind of, it could be, it's
Yeah.
very much, the question of racism is very much a question of how could it be, right? Like Eicha, what Jeremiah says, how could it be? How could it be? How could it be that this is how we are treating each other who are created in the image of God,
Yeah, thank you so much, Rav Isaiah and Rav Avton. I think that that's really insightful. And I think we'll just spend the last couple of minutes, Rav Isaiah. We have some questions from the community for you.
Please.
Okay, so the first one is, why are Jews generally seemingly more racist than non-Jews, especially since we know what prejudice feels like?
Oh, bombshell question. It's a really good question. I mean, it goes back to Rav Avson's question of just like what? But yeah, it's a complicated question too, because is it true that we are falling behind and that we're not engaged in this issue? I don't know. I mean, like, it's complicated. I'll say that like a lot of people, both even thinking about the people I know in Crown Heights who are dedicating their lives to like race relations and to social equity, and specifically my role now working through the federation system. My job is, as a Jew of color, I'm in a senior position over 146 federations. Like, so in many ways, like the Jewish community is doing the work, I think is involved. And I think we're also, I don't know how it is in South Africa, but in America, out of any faith group in America, the Jewish community is the most organized faith group. And even just the job that I'm taking again, that I'm working in now with Jewish federations, like we're focused on police reform. We're focused on policy stuff. My boss was on a phone with a senator yesterday while I was in a meeting. He's like, hold on one second. And he's like, hi, Senator. You know, like there's relationships, there's deep relationships. The Jews are doing stuff. Like it's not like we're, with that said, the question of, there's a Gemara in Bava Metzia, a piece of Talmud that writes, right? The rabbi asks, why, right? Mipnei ma? For what reason does the Torah mention in 36 places, and some say, oh, arba'im, or maybe it says 46 places, lo tono es ager, right? Lo tachitzenu es ager. Don't put pressure on the stranger. Why does the Torah remind us in 46 places? Because you were once strangers in the land. What does that mean? Because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Almost to tell us that the reason why the Torah repeats this so many times is because we understand oppression. We do. We really do, by the way. We understand what it means to be enslaved, not only in the experience of Egypt, but the last 2,000 years of exile have not been easy for the Jews, like at all. And it's only really the last 200 years, I think I maybe mentioned this, but if you look at Jewish history, it's basically the last 200 years where Jews are functionally being able to be represented in society in a way that essentially makes them still a minority group, but also helps them have access to certain levels of power that were never possible in Jewish history, because power constantly turns. And we're even seeing in America right now a question of like what's going on with American democracy, right? And it is alarming and concerning to the Jews. But I would say that, like, you're right, and I'll land because I know we don't have so much time. You're right in saying that something has shifted in the last few hundred years. Like what happened when Jews gained their mobility, and it's not true in every country, so I'm speaking for America. What happened when Jews in America started having certain privileges where they forgot to stand up for other marginalized populations? Where did we go? And we were involved deeply in the civil rights era. I just want to and also in starting the NAACP, we were involved. We funded a lot of social equity causes throughout American history. So the Jews are there. But in the last 40, 50 years, it's almost as if we left our voice, at least American Jews, we left our voice in the civil rights era. Obviously, Crown Heights, like as the Rav was sharing, we see moments of rioting, but not necessarily relationships. The relationships right now, we're at a new moment. We're at a new moment in Jewish life to really strengthen our relationships with other marginalized groups, with other minority groups, and to also use the power of our tradition to really activate people to to lift the world from love, like everything that we're describing that our tradition already brings us to do.
Thank you so much. I think we'll do one last question. And that is, in our South African way of life and community, where our kids mainly see Black people in menial positions or positions where they're our house, our nannies or cleaners or helpers in that way, how do you teach them that Black people actually don't exist just to serve them?
Yo, super real. I'll also just clarify. I don't think this is, specifically only an issue around power dynamics and power and race dynamics for Jewish communal life. I think in America also, most of the help specifically for whatever it might be at home or domestic needs or support for caregivers and health caregivers or different essential workers, very often also in Jewish communities in America and in New York, those people are also people of color. And it is tricky, I think, in terms of how do we educate our children? The question of how do we educate our children around race, I think, is a very important question. I think in general, chinuch, we know education, Jewish education, but frankly, how we rear our youth is tailor-made to your family, to your experience. But we also know that exposure is also really important for children, right? What do we expose it for, both, in the good and the bad, right? What we expose them to truly does impact them and influence them. And what they hear from us truly does impact and influence them. And so when it comes to, let's say, people who have taken care of your children, who maybe have a very different origin story than you, at the end of the day, what would exposure look like for your child to understand that person's history? What would it look like? And sometimes it's not like you're not going to sit down with a 4-year-old. I don't know what age bracket this question is coming from, but you're not going to sit down with a 4-year-old and take them through apartheid in South Africa, that's a little high level. But what about the fact that all of our grandparents came from different places, and like we come from different places, and we all have different stories, and yeah, and it's true that this moment, and again, not coming from South Africa, it's true that there are systemic power dynamics, right? There's the systemic issue where we see that, right? You're seeing a whole vocation, a whole trade, and this is true in America, true. Whole trades, whole areas of work that are the workforce of people of color. And in Israel, like, right, the whole construction workforce, it's not the whole, but a big piece of the construction workforce is Muslim, Arabic, and Ethiopian Jewish, right? And it's like, what, like, how inheriting that is messy. And I'm not saying that it's not there, but how you approach teaching your children, I think it's just knowing through what's appropriate for you and your children. How do you create opportunities for them to learn, to become more affiliated? And also, like, what are ways you could, like, remind, like, I think a huge thing is like where we're seated, right? Like, this is the last thing, the last question, right, about Jewish responsibility, right, to stand up and to be supportive and to approach people with kindness and with Jewish values that we know. There are 1,000 opportunities where you have the people who are working for you. There are 1,000 opportunities where you could remind them that you see their heartbeat, that you see that they're human, that you see that they're working. And it doesn't necessarily need to be through more money. Like, it could really just be through you saying, hey, writing them a little note, something that, like, basic things to say, like, hey, like, I don't even really, I wouldn't even know how to begin to understand you, or to begin to understand what you've been through. And I understand that we're in, and you don't even have to say this, but you, for yourself, you're like, you understand there's a power dynamic, but how do you lift them up? How do you show them that you care about them? How do you show them that you see them in their full humanity? What are you doing for their family? Do you ask about their family? Do you ask them about, like, how do you make them feel human? Because the systems are the systems, and we need to change them, but it's not one day.
I think those are really great points, Rav Isaiah. I would want to say a huge thank you to Rav Isaiah for sharing your story, your experiences, and some really, really important insights on racial inequality and potentially things we can do to move towards more racial equality. And I just want to turn it over to Rav Avtzon to conclude. Rav Avtzon, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Isaiah, if you don't mind, give me 2 more minutes. I want to say two things. Number one, I pray for a day that none of us are defined by anything, just by being human. Not by sexuality, not by our color of skin, not by any definition other than our own character. And I believe it's going to be a journey to get there, but I don't think the journey is just going straight to there. I think the journey is first and foremost acknowledging difference, and difference doesn't matter. So on that point of difference, acknowledging difference, for me, I find that a Jew being a racist is extremely ungrateful. And I'll tell you why, straight out. Who was the biggest tormentor of the Jews? White blondies with blue eyes. Okay, those beautiful, good-looking fellows from Europe, whether Russian, whether Polish. What have the blacks done to us? So yes, here in South Africa, we've suffered a bit of violence, but like, I just find that so ungrateful from a historical perspective to think that the threat to the Jewish community is coming from the black community. Like, are you kidding me? Really? Like, it's not. Yes, there are tense issues and this and that, but historically, the blacks aren't racist. I mean, they're not anti-Semitic. That anti-Semitism we've suffered is from the beautiful whites. So, like, for you to look at a black person and see them any less than a white, on the contrary, if we're playing the race card, why are you putting the whites on a pedestal? But as I said, first point, I hope and pray for a day when race doesn't matter, where gender doesn't matter, where sexuality doesn't matter, where religion doesn't matter, and we just see each other as human beings created.
Amen, amen.
Amen, amen. Thank you so much, Rav Isaiah. Thank you so much, Rav Avtzon. Thank you so much to everybody, and have a beautiful night.
Bye, friends. See you next time.